We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
All art forms are in the service of the greatest of all arts, the art of living. Bertolt Brecht, Politics and Society. Imagine this. You find yourself in a cave, an underground den so deep that no light penetrates from the surface. There are people residing in the cave, and you see that they are held by chains, so they cannot leave. This den is a prison. As you look closer, you notice that they are restrained in a very peculiar way. They sit on the ground, and their necks and feet are chained so that they can neither get up and move about nor turn their heads from side to side. They gaze ceaselessly at the wall of the cave in front of them. Now, far behind and above the prisoners is a huge fire that glows brilliantly, and between the fire and the prisoners is a high stone wall. Figures pass to and fro on top of the wall, casting shadows of their forms on the cave wall that the prisoners can see, and this is all they can see. This continual shadow play of the figures passing left and right behind them, perhaps dancing or fighting or even making love, or at least pretending to. As you look at the prisoners watching this dumb show, something strange begins to occur to you. The looks on their faces don't suggest misery or despair. No, they seem amused and genuinely interested by the scenes playing out before them. When they speak, they don't cry out for mercy or help. They give voice to the shadow figures moving, working, dancing on the wall, as if when their voices echo back at them, they imagine those voices were the voices of the characters in the drama. At first you think these people have gone insane, driven mad by their captivity. But then it dawns on you, no. They're not insane. It's just that this is all they know. They've been here since they were children. They've never seen the outside world. They don't see their shackles for what they are. Those shadows cast on the wall are the only visible forms they have ever seen, their own voices echoing back, the only sounds they have ever heard, and they are so thoroughly absorbed in the performance that they take it for actual reality. Now, suppose that one of the prisoners gets free. Perhaps you release her from her shackles. Supposing her legs work, and she's able to get up and move around, what do you expect might happen? Well, when she turns and sees the apparatus of the performance and the other people chained and thralled, she would at first be deeply disoriented. The light from the flame would sting her eyes, and she would have no schema, no psychological or cognitive model that would allow her to comprehend what she's seeing. Her first instinct might be to sit down and put the shackles back on to return to her comfortable delusion, the only life she has ever known, and try to convince herself that this strange interlude was only a dream. But supposing she doesn't. Supposing she persists and continues to examine her surroundings. Eventually, she might come to see the situation for what it is. She would then be stunned by the depth of the illusion that had formerly enveloped her. At this point, there is no going back. She cannot unsee what she has seen. She cannot unknow what she now knows. Her consciousness has been radically transformed, and nothing will ever be the same. But it doesn't stop there. At some point, she may discover the path out of the cave, a dark tunnel that snakes away, gradually working upward. Mustering all her courage and driven by a thirst for understanding, she takes the long journey up this passage until eventually it opens up into a wide, bright, seemingly limitless space with a light 1,000 times more radiant than the flame burning in the cave. She has come into the outside world for the first time, seen and felt the light of the sun for the first time, and she will soon see trees and clouds and animals and perhaps people and roads and buildings for the first time. The shock she felt when she first turned and saw the flame burning in the cave was like a rap on the knuckles compared to this. She cannot believe these phantasms are real, and she wants so badly to run back down into the only world she has ever known. But she stays and adjusts to the warmth and the light. And she experiences, gradually, a still deeper conversion in her awareness, making her earlier transformation but a pale precursor to this great awakening. She had been given a glimpse of truth before, but she had still been casting about in darkness and illusion. This is something far more glorious and true. But perhaps, at this point, she's learned a lesson. She's learned to be a bit more skeptical about this succession of revelations she seems to be having. Perhaps she wonders if this too, this outside world that seems so real, may be yet another layer of illusion, another veil concealing the ultimate truth. She begins to ask what force powers the sun and what lies beyond the mantle of the wide blue sky, how and why this world got here at all, and what sustains it in its endless turnings and permutations. She has learned from her experience in the cave not to trust uncritically the evidence of her senses, but to try to look behind or beyond all phenomena in search of the underlying reality. This is the allegory of the cave from Plato's Republic. Socrates, the central figure in this as in most of Plato's writing, describes this rather unlikely scenario to illustrate the path taken by the philosopher from darkness to light, from ignorance to enlightenment. Socrates goes on to imagine this liberated person returning to the cave and trying to tell people what they've seen. And, of course it doesn't go so well. They're not taken seriously. Just like a lot of folks in Athens saw Socrates as kind of a clown. Nonetheless, it is the philosopher's job first to awaken himself and then try, if ever in vain, to awaken others. Curiously, though, at least it's curious to me, Socrates didn't see a role for art in this project. Waking people up, lifting the veil of illusion, was the sole province of philosophy. Art, in fact, was a part of the problem, a big part. Art equals deception, illusion, pretending things are real that are not real, falsehood masquerading as truth. It was art, mind you, that kept the captives in the cave steeped in their fantasy. The delightfulness of the performances so dazzled them that they failed to ask what was really going on, who was keeping them there, and what interests their bondage served. It was art that kept them so inebriated, so insensate, so entertained, that they failed to realize they were prisoners. Socrates was skeptical of the role of art in the life of the mind. Elsewhere in the Republic, he goes so far as to conclude that he would ban dramatic poets, what today we will call playwrights and actors and filmmakers, ban them from his ideal society. Stories about the gods would occupy a small role in the formal education of youths to help instill in them certain moral and civic virtues, but beyond that, nothing. Dramatic narratives distorted the truth and corrupted the people. I'm not so sure, however, that Socrates was giving art a fair shake. I wonder if there might be more of a role for art to play in illumination than he allowed. I wonder if art, in any number of ways, might reveal to us the forces that bind us and provide us with the means to escape from them. Can art, rather than casting pleasant illusions on the wall, instead be used to dispel illusion? Can art be the light that shows us the way out? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. The allegory of the cave has become a foundational narrative in Western thought, and in spite of Socrates' protestations, the allegory has also inspired any number of dramatic narratives. Pedro Calderón de la Barca's Spanish Golden Age drama La Vida es Sueña, Life is a Dream, explores a character's delivery out of illusion and subsequent descent back into it. Hollywood has turned out numerous products that have echoes of The Cave, from Pleasantville to The Truman Show, and of course it's hard to imagine a more on-the-nose adaptation of the allegory than The Matrix, with Neo emerging from the illusion of the Matrix into the real world of the devastated Earth, where human beings are quite literally prisoners in a cave. In those movies, of course, the philosophical strains are somewhat subordinated to the martial arts-driven action sequences and the triumphal savior narrative. No philosopher king here, but a jujitsu Jesus. I could do a whole episode on plays and films and short stories and novels, for that matter, that parallel or resemble the allegory of the cave, but, there's probably a listicle for that somewhere. I'm actually more interested in how the paths and approaches of artists might resonate with the path of the philosopher described in the story. And I want to focus on the specific art form that Plato and Socrates seem to have most squarely in their crosshairs: theater. And while there would be plenty to say about the Greek theater that graced the giant amphitheaters in Plato's time, Socrates might in fact have been picking a bone because of the way he was depicted by Aristophanes, we'll instead fast forward to Germany in the 1920s. It was the summer of 1927. The Baden-Baden Music Festival in Western Germany, 170 kilometers south of Frankfurt, was in full swing. Vacationers relaxed at the spas during the day and dressed to the nines at night, flocking to the concert hall to hear the latest offerings from Germany's foremost modern composers and librettists. It was here that a pair of artists still in their 20s, playwright Bertolt Brecht and composer Kurt Weill, decided to debut their first collaboration, a song cycle called Little Mahogany. It might have seemed like an odd venue for the pair to showcase their work. The festival had originally been subsidized by royalty, and although by the 1920s it had become an artistically progressive event, showcasing the work of modern composers who were upending the tyranny of the classical 12-tone system, its social milieu remained stubbornly elitist, as reflected by composer Arnold Schoenberg, who extolled the festival as reminiscent of the days when a prince stood as protector before an artist, showing the rabble that art, a matter for princes, is beyond the judgment of common people. This Tony atmosphere hardly could have seemed a place where Brecht and Weill might expect their work to find a friendly audience, at least not the kind of audience they sought. Brecht was an avowed communist, and Weill at least a communist sympathizer. They wanted to create work that would appeal to people of all classes and social groups, but especially to the working class. And they were committed to the notion of art as an agent of social change. They were committed, in fact, to upending the isolationism of the Schoenberg school and replacing it with music and theater that had a purpose, what was called Gebrauchsmusik, along with music that was deeply rooted in German communities and culture, Gemeinschaftsmusik, what we might call folk music in English. The musical drama they had concocted was not only a new work, but represented a new brand of subversive, socially engaged musical theater. Set in a fantasy version of the U.S. South, Little Mahogany featured newcomer Lotte Lenya leading a chorus of young women playing women of ill repute. They sang about their desire for little more than the next pour of whiskey and made slanted wordplay with the English terms Alabama and Mama, as well as quibbles on horseflesh and whore's flesh. It was not the kind of work the polite, pampered attendees of the festival were used to seeing, and it was a huge success. As told by Pamela Katz in her delightful book, The Partnership, Brecht, Weill, Three Women and Germany on the Brink, the audience was equally scandalized and thrilled. They left the theater arguing over what they had seen, in some cases denouncing it, but also humming the tune of the show-stopping Alabama song. It was exactly what Brecht and Weill had hoped for. Theater that would provoke people, get them talking spiritedly about the performance, and still more important, get them thinking about the issues that were affecting modern society. The splash they made with Little Mahogany also presaged an even more unlikely success they would have only a couple years later. Their now legendary Threepenny Opera. Coming up in Germany in the early 20th century, Brecht and Weil found themselves in an artistic environment where innovation wasn't yet suppressed, as it soon would be under the Nazis, but where art, no matter how stylistically free-thinking and modern, occupied a separate realm from the real decisions affecting society. Educated people read poetry and listened to music for nothing more than pure aesthetic contemplation, the kind expounded by good German philosophers like Hegel and Schopenhauer. They went to the theater to be entertained, or perhaps attended a production of Shakespeare or Goethe for a bit of intellectual exercise and edification. Nobody partook of art because they imagined it might change their lives, much less change the structure of society. And as for the rabble, no one in polite society really thought much about what kind of art they were consuming, nor would they have considered the songs and poems of the regular people deserving of the term art. Brecht, and Weil as well, but my focus here is going to be on Brecht, envisioned something different. He was deeply interested in the notion of a Lehrstück, or learning play, a work of drama whose principal purpose was to teach a lesson. Did he want it to be entertaining? Of course, but as a kind of Trojan horse for the educational load the play would deliver. Like Plato, Brecht realized the power of education to shape people's outlook and character. But unlike Plato, he didn't imagine art occupying a minor, receding role in education. He wanted art to be front stage center. Brecht's views on the power of education and on the civic and political dimensions of education derived from his own experiences in school. Around 1915, when he was a student at the Augsburg Realgymnasium, the premier school for teenage boys in his hometown in Bavaria, young Brecht wrote a commentary on a classical text that was so impertinent, so scandalous, so outrageous and threatening to the foundations of German society that it almost got him expelled from school. Commenting on a famous passage from Horace, the aspiring poet and playwright wrote, "The expression that it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country can only be taken as crude propaganda. Only blockheads can carry their vanity to the point of speaking of the leap through the dark gateway as being easy." With Germany entrenched in the First World War and running short on human fuel to feed the war machine, ever younger and less able soldiers were being conscripted, including a number of Brecht's friends and siblings. In that light, such a brazen and unpatriotic statement of dissent from the war effort simply could not be tolerated. He may as well have ordered French fries instead of freedom fries after the American invasion of Iraq. And this act of intellectual rebellion would have been especially surprising to the teachers and administrators at the school because young Brecht had previously published, only months earlier, some odes to the German spirit that expressed the nationalist fervor gripping much of Germany. He also published an essay arguing the inevitability of going to war and describing the spiritual power of Kaiser Wilhelm in almost messianic terms. Now, he was publicly calling anyone foolish enough to glorify a soldier's death a blockhead, and being called onto the carpet for it. It's impossible to know exactly what precipitated Brecht's thinking about the war. It probably had something to do with his friends and brothers being drafted. But whatever the cause of his conversion, it seems clear that running afoul of authority in this way laid the groundwork for the acerbic anti-authoritarianism that would characterize his philosophy and his work. This incident helped Brecht to understand, as Plato understood, how schools could be breeding grounds for ideology, and that education, potentially a source of enlightenment, is often a means of pulling the wool over young people's eyes. For Brecht, this may have been the moment when he first shook off his shackles and turned to see the apparatus of the shadow play he'd been eating up his whole life. It was the beginning of his escape from the cave. Decades later, in the dialogue Conversations in Exile, Brecht would have a character offering the following remarks on a modern education. The young person in school is monstrously confronted by the barbarian in unforgettable forms. The latter possesses almost limitless power. Equipped with pedagogical skills and many years of experience, he trains the student to become a prototype of himself. The student learns everything required for getting ahead in the world, the very same things that are necessary for getting ahead in school. Deceit, pretending to have knowledge one does not have, the ability to get even without being punished for it, speedy acquisition of cliches, flattery, subservience, and so on and so on. In this passage, we see premonitions of Foucault's later remarks about the prison-like structure of modern schools. It also puts me in mind of Pink Floyd's The Wall. If this is what a conventional education was doing to the children of the West, then what citizens required was a re-education, a new set of lessons, and a new way of learning that would pull back the veil and cast a shocking but ultimately cleansing and vivifying light on the corruptions of the modern world. Brecht's aim throughout his career was to use theater to provide that education. Berlin in the 1920s provided an ideal forum for this young artist to train and test his revolutionary aesthetics. The metropolis in the Weimar era was a hotbed of progressive activity, with people of diverse ethnicities, nationalities, and religious and socioeconomic backgrounds all mingling in the crowded cafe and cabaret scenes. In his early 20s, Brecht became a member of the politically and artistically radical November Group, a collective of avant-garde artists loosely organized around the idea of promoting a general cultural revolution. And throughout his life, he surrounded himself with like-minded friends and colleagues, who were all committed to the idea that the arts could rally the people and be potent agents for social change. Brecht was a Marxist. He wanted to create art that would rouse the working people of Germany and the rest of Europe to organize and bring about a more just, communist society. But one senses in reading both his dramatic work and his essays that while Marxism provided a philosophical framework for his ideas, advancing that specific ideology was less important to him than the more basic project of getting people to think for themselves and question the status quo. The main tasks for Brecht were 1. To speak truth to power, and 2. To rouse people out of the moral and intellectual torpor that kept them accepting received ideas and values. One of Brecht's most revolutionary and enduring ideas was that all art is political. In his thinking, when artists abstain from challenging the status quo, they tacitly endorse the status quo, and thereby sanction the existing power structures that support and profit from that state of things. As Brecht put it, for art to be unpolitical means only to ally itself with the ruling group. Any art that does not seek to change people's minds and hearts, to enlighten them by lifting the veil and revealing to them the truth about the world and their place in the world, serves to support, perpetuate, and even to propagate the existing order, either deliberately as propaganda for the reigning powers, or by default, as in bourgeois art, which serves as a distraction, an opiate, or at best a palliative to the people who, in the absence of such narcotic entertainment, might be sufficiently roused to change the conditions they have tacitly accepted since birth. That kind of theater, that kind of entertainment, may help us deal with our situation, but it can't help us change it. In Brecht's view, any artist living in a time of great injustice and turmoil who refuses to address the atrocities happening around them is morally culpable. As he notes in the poem To Those Born Later, at times such as those he was living in, a talk about trees is almost a crime, because it implies silence about so many horrors. Nor was art that showed restraint in its satire and critique of modern society sufficient, or even useful, in Brecht's view. As he observes in the poem quotation, little changes are the enemies of great changes. Half measures are hazardous. Just ask Walter White. All the bourgeois theater and music that Brecht saw and heard around him, the parlor dramas and mannered operas that had defined the European stages of the 19th century, had the collective effect of inuring people to the perversions of the political system under which the many toiled and a handful profited. Where Plato, by way of Socrates, saw drama and poetry as dangers to the integrity of a just state, Brecht realized that they could just as well be threats to an unjust state. Brecht's fear was not that art would be revolutionary, but that it would fail to be. He didn't worry that art would excite people to immoral acts, but that in the hands of hacks who had the sanction and support of the reigning powers, it would enervate them and keep them from acting up. He saw popular entertainment making people so comfortable that they felt neither the energy nor the need to speak truth to power and to stand up to their oppressors. He wanted to seize the power, the capacity of art to do the opposite, to agitate, to inspire brave and bold action, to confront and hopefully to disrupt the status quo. And he was nothing if not grandly ambitious about his potential to influence people en masse. He wasn't writing plays meant for a rarefied elite of blue-haired theatergoers. He wanted his drama to be as popular as sporting events. Make no bones about it, he wrote in a 1926 newspaper article. We have our eye on those huge stadiums filled with 15,000 men and women of every variety. A theater which makes no contact with the public is a nonsense. After seeing the light himself, Brecht didn't merely want to tiptoe back down into the cave and whisper in the ears of a few of his compatriots, trying to persuade a handful of lucky souls to liberate themselves. No. He wanted to raid the place and bring those people hooting and screaming out into the light. This artistic populism was an ideal Brecht genuinely held, but it was also a strategic approach to getting his message across. He understood that successful propaganda is not a rod that drives people, but a sail that catches their energy. In that same article from 1926, he wrote, "People are always telling us that we mustn't simply produce what the public demands, but I believe that an artist is unlikely to produce anything without some wind in his sails." Brecht's theater was truly meant as art for the people, to quote a popular rallying cry of the November Group. This was a far cry from art for art's sake, which had been the bohemian credo of the 19th century, as well as the idea behind the quote that gives this podcast its title. Brecht was convinced that theater could change the world. He was also convinced that he was a brilliant enough dramatist to get the job done. His first couple of plays caused scandals in Munich and Berlin because of their political content and their general disregard for established standards of taste. What's more, he devised a new form of drama that he called epic theater, which he imagined could transcend the usual goal of offering the spectator an enjoyable and edifying evening. Instead, it would provoke the audience and promote personal and social transformation. He pursued this type of response through a combination of stylistic tactics. He employed a presentational style of design and production in which the spectator is reminded at all times that what they are watching is a play, a piece of fiction, something artificial. The musicians in the premiere of the Threepenny Opera would sit up on the stage rather than being tucked away in a subterranean pit from which the music magically emanated. No drapes or flats would be used to mask the ropes that lifted the curtain and the set pieces. And in a device invented with his scenic designer Caspar Nair, unsightly placards would be brought out with text giving away the events to come. The driving conceit throughout most of the history of Western drama had been to cultivate a suspension of disbelief in the spectator, to deliver a fiction so convincing that they would temporarily allow themselves to believe that it was real. But this, for Brecht, represented a seductive illusion, and he wanted to undo this illusion and use the artistry of the theater to provoke the spectator to reflect on the reality of the world. So his productions would persistently remind them that it was all fake, exposing the apparatus of the spectacle and shattering the spell that was normally wrought by an absorbing drama. This was complemented by a style of performance that produces an alienation or distancing effect. The actors, rather than disappearing into their roles, would keep the portrayal at a slight remove from their own perspective on things, which they never fully abandoned. The performers combined this with a technique called gestus, a method of physical posturing and gesture that would suggest a character's attitude or motivation at a moment of dramatic action, especially in terms of their social relations and dynamics. For, as Brecht assures us, it is what happens between people that provides them with all the material that they can discuss, criticize, alter. The desired outcome was to give the audience something that was entertaining and engaging, worth going to see on a Friday night after a long week at the shop. but which would allow the spectator to maintain a critical distance, so that rather than becoming so emotionally involved in the petty dramas experienced by the characters, they would be able to think about and question what they've seen, to draw their own conclusions, and argue about it with their friends. At the beginning of the century, Stanislavski and company had brought about a revolution of realism in the theater, notably in Stanislavski's interpretations of Chekhov. I talk about this a bit in Season 1, Episode 2, Misinterpretations. Now Brecht was rejecting the artistic foundations of that movement, suggesting that realistic drama is the latter-day equivalent of the shadow plays imagined by Socrates, an emotional and cognitive illusion that absorbs the spectator so that they fail to see the mechanisms of their subjugation. Naturalistic theater could not do the job of speaking truth to power and waking people up. It was a tool for reinforcing the status quo. He writes, "The theatergoer in conventional dramatic theater says, 'Yes, I've felt that way too. That's the way I am. That's life. That's the way it will always be. The suffering of this or that person grips me because there is no escape for him. That's great art. Everything is self-evident. I am made to cry with those that cry and laugh with those who laugh.' But the theatergoer in the epic theater says, 'I would never have thought that. You can't do that. That's very strange, practically unbelievable. That has to stop. The suffering of this or that person grips me because there is an escape for him. That's great art. Nothing is self-evident. I am made to laugh about those who cry and cry about those who laugh.'" In Brecht's view, the folks behind the spectacle were the wealthy land and business owners, capitalists, bankers, and investors. "What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?" a character in one of his plays asks, along with their cronies in the government. His art was not going to create a smokescreen for them and be a narcotic entertainment that would keep the people docile. No, he was intent on exposing the lies and corruption and inhumanity of his age. In the 1930s and 40s, Brecht wrote with renewed vigor about the importance of speaking truth to power. He wrote in 1935, "Nowadays, anyone who wishes to combat lies and ignorance and to write the truth must overcome at least 5 difficulties. He must have the courage to write the truth when truth is everywhere opposed, the keenness to recognize it although it is everywhere concealed, the skill to manipulate it as a weapon, the judgment to select those in whose hands it will be effective, and the running to spread the truth among such persons." Brecht wanted to change people's minds, not only about particular issues, but in relation to the work itself. He wanted to invest his work with serious themes and messages and to force a discussion on the issues of the day. It might be hard for us today to see how revolutionary this was. We've grown accustomed over the past few decades to literature and theater and movies and popular music with a strong social or political message. We almost take it for granted that many, if not most, artists are inclined to challenge the status quo. But this tendency, if not entirely absent prior to the 20th century, was not the prevailing mode of artistic creation. Brecht truly was its prophet. In 1954, not long before his death, Brecht would come within a hair's breadth of directly invoking Plato, writing, "It is not enough to demand insight and informative images of reality from the theater. Our theater must stimulate a desire for understanding, a delight in changing reality. Our audience must experience not only the ways to free Prometheus, but be schooled in the very desire to free him. Theater must teach all the pleasures and joys of discovery, all the feelings of triumph associated with liberation. Theater must teach. It must teach people to think for themselves, teach them to see clearly what's going on around them and to combat the forces to which they are subjugated. It must teach them, in short, to live." I think it's fair to ask, especially given Brecht's loudly proclaimed ambitions, just how successful was he in his lofty pursuits? Was he able to effect the kind of personal and societal transformation that he describes in his essays on politics and art? Was he able to reach the kind of audience that he sought. Within the theater, Brecht has had an incalculable influence. Though the Stanislavskian approach to acting is still dominant, a number of Brechtian techniques have become commonplaces, even cliches in Western stagecraft. His plays informed the work of Brazilian playwright Augusto Boal, a major figure in the development of agitprop drama, Luis Valdez, a luminary in the Chicano theater, and Tony Kushner, the author of Angels in America, among other great pieces. Stephen Brockman, a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and president of the International Brecht Society, called Brecht, without a doubt, the most important and influential dramatist of the 20th century. But I'm not sure that Brecht would have been content with that. He so clearly wanted his sphere of influence to extend beyond traditional theater-goers and theater makers. What about those stadiums and arenas that he wrote about in 1926? Did his work ever reach that kind of audience? In 1933, fearing the rise of the Nazis, Brecht and his family fled Germany and eventually made their way to the US, where they set up shop in Hollywood. Brecht realized the potential of the medium of cinema, and he hoped to break into the movie business and to see his work reach a wider audience on the silver screen. But the culture and sensibility of Hollywood were fundamentally at odds with Brecht's outlook and his values. Brecht was a communist, and in spite of what the members of the House Un-American Activities Committee suspected, Hollywood filmmaking has always been a capitalist enterprise. While impressed by the city's openness and liberality, Brecht felt increasingly alienated in Hollywood, referring to LA as a place where you even sell your piss to the urinal. But it wasn't just the commercial ethos that alienated Brecht from Hollywood. It was also a philosophical disagreement with the increasingly dogmatic conventions of Hollywood storytelling. Aristotelian in spirit, Hollywood storytelling is highly individualistic, following the struggles and ultimate triumph of a hero against seemingly overwhelming odds. And the moment-to-moment currency of Hollywood films is the viewer's identification with the hero and emotional involvement in their struggle. In Brecht's view, this was precisely the kind of narcotic illusion that kept people drooling on the floor of the cave, or of the movie theater, gleefully oblivious to their subjugation. He wanted to wield the cinema as a tool to knock people out of their stupor, not to keep them enthralled. His own epic theater involves a philosophical rejection of the idea that individuals determine their own fates. Their triumph or their doom is dictated by societal forces. The takeaway being that if we want to change our individual outcomes, what is required is collective action to change the society that produces those outcomes. I've heard it said, and I really like this idea, that rather than the tragic flaw possessed by protagonists in classical Western drama, Brecht's characters often have a tragic virtue, a positive character trait that puts them at odds with society and their circumstances, and ineluctably occasions their downfall. In Mother Courage and Her Children, for instance, it's the title character's rather admirable perseverance and practicality that, in conflict with the madness surrounding her, ultimately spelled the devastation of her family. Brecht's failure in the film industry, of course, may not be due solely to anything about epic drama that is intrinsically unappealing to a mass audience. It has just as much to do with Brecht's own obstinacy. We could say that his egotism was his tragic flaw, or that his refusal to compromise was a tragic virtue. In any case, Brecht never found a foothold in Hollywood. Apart from a somewhat neutered German film production of The Threepenny Opera, a production so beset with artistic disagreements that it led both Brecht and Weill to sue the producers, Brecht's screen credits would be limited to a smattering of television specials adapted from his plays. But there may be an argument that Brecht's influence has worked its way into the cinema, if somewhat circuitously. Beginning with the New Hollywood of the 1970s and the subsequent rise of the American independent cinema, film over the past several decades has become more socially aware and engaged. Spike Lee is a prime example of a filmmaker who takes a rather Brechtian approach to his work. His 1989 masterpiece, Do the Right Thing, has many, if not all, of the hallmarks of epic drama. a dialectical approach to a complex set of social issues, ensemble storytelling that refuses to reify or valorize the significance of individual action, a heightened style that at times directly engages and implicates the viewer, and a final provocation that compels the viewer to question where they stand. In 1996, Spike Lee directed a concert film of John Leguizamo's Broadway hit Freak. Like Lee, Leguizamo is fluent in playing ideas and perspectives off one another, of blending sincerity and over-the-top stylistic flair, and most poignantly, of simultaneously entertaining and provoking his audiences. These skills and devices are on display again in Leguizamo's latest work, Latin History for Morons. It's hard not to see a kind of Brechtian gestalt in Leguizamo's idiomatic poetry, his physicality, and his dialectical leveraging of various points of view. But there may be another way we can consider Brecht's artistic and cultural influence. And you can tell by the music that this is the part of the episode where I get all cynical and sardonic. Brecht was forced to leave Germany in the early 1930s because of the rise of the Nazi Party. The Third Reich was hostile not only to artists who were affiliated with the Communist Party, which Brecht was, but also to work that was too free-thinking and innovative, regardless of its particular ideological bent. Independent artistic innovation is toxic to totalitarian regimes because it stimulates free thought. It gets people asking what people or systems are producing the light that casts those shadows onto the walls of their particular cave, and who or what may be profiting from their bondage. It gets people in the mental habit of imagining other ways that things could be, and as a natural consequence, noticing the chains that bind their own wrists and ankles. The leaders of the Third Reich weren't dismissive or disdainful of art. No. They were keenly aware of its power. They knew that the plays and movies people attended, the books they read, and the music they heard could serve either to unify the country under the Nazi ideology, or to open the fault lines in the shaky foundation of a ruling party that, remember, never received the electoral support of a majority of the German public. The Nazis used much of the logic of the epic theater, promoting the idea that German ascendancy was an inevitable historical force rather than a toxic ideology promoted by a fierce, clever, and ultimately lucky group of political insurrectionists. Hitler used physical posturing and gestures in ways that called to mind the power of the Brechtian gestus. The reach of his political theater, as demonstrated in his legendary rallies, outstripped even Brecht's ambitions of filling arenas and stadiums with crowds of working people. And Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, with the aid of the young filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, was able to harness the power of the cinematic medium in a way that eluded Brecht in his misadventures in the American West. Art has no inherent spirit or aim, ethical or ideological mooring. Art is a tool that can be wielded for any number of purposes, in pursuit of any number of ends. It can be the shadow play that keeps people enthralled and captive, or the light that exposes their captivity. I keep coming back to Brecht's populist aims, how he wanted to make theater that would fill arenas and stadiums. Hitler accomplished this task in Germany in a political context, and it has been accomplished in the US in a commercial one. World Wrestling Entertainment produces a brand of live theater that does much of what Brecht wanted to do. It rivals the popularity and profitability of professional sports, with the corporation's annual profits in the ballpark of an NBA franchise. And it does so, once again, using some of the staples of Brechtian stagecraft. The outsized characters and trumped-up physical language, even some faux ideological meta-narrational flourishes involving the chairman, Vince McMahon. The WWE has constructed an elaborate dialectical framework to ballast what might look like mindless entertainment. And even the performative grammar encourages viewers to engage in a Brechtian game with regard to its reality versus unreality. Just imagine, then, if there were an entertainer savvy enough to realize and to harness the persuasive potential concealed in what professional wrestling peddles as entertainment. A figure who had, perhaps, even made an occasional appearance on the WWE stage. A figure who, like Brecht, understands the subconscious power of physical posturing.
Now we were on a small stage, and no matter where I walked, he followed me closely, staring at me, making faces.
And employs text as much for provocation as for identification.
No, not you. Not you. Your organization's terrible. Your organization's terrible. Let's go. Go ahead. Quiet. Quiet.
A figure who, perhaps also like Brecht, is a serially philandering egomaniac, but who, unlike Brecht, has no interest in getting people to think for themselves, and wishes instead only to use these potent theatrical devices to advance his own agenda. Just imagine that. If Brecht had seen something like that coming, he would have been the first to tell us to watch out. This episode of Quite Useless was written, recorded, produced, performed, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. You can find every episode of Quite Useless on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to drop me a line, I'm on Twitter at QUPodcast, though I don't go on very often. And the website is thisisquiteuseless.com. Subscribe, download, enjoy. I found a lot of great sources during the course of my research for this episode, but I owe a particular debt to Pamela Katz for her book, The Partnership, Brecht, Weil, Three Women, and Germany on the Brink. It focuses on the tumultuous collaboration between Brecht and Weil, as well as their many, many, many romantic and artistic liaisons. Along with the narrative about their debut at the Baden-Baden Music Festival, Katz delivers stirring accounts of events throughout the pair's career. Her chapter on the premiere of the Threepenny Opera had me literally gasping. It's a book that distills a huge amount of research into a package that is informative, illuminating, and wonderfully readable. Thanks as well to Professor Stephen Brockman of Carnegie Mellon University, who crystallized a lot of information about Brecht's influence when I reached out to him in preparing this episode. This episode is the first in a short sequence relating to Plato's Republic and the notion of art as a tool for yanking us out of our familiar and comfortable illusions. I had only planned to do one, maybe two episodes on the topic, but during the long, unanticipated hiatus since the last episode, which, sorry about that, I got thinking about it and realized that there was so much more territory to mine. So I've opened up a quarry, right in the heart of Plato's idyllic republic, and I'm digging holes and dropping dynamite and extracting everything I can. Next on the docket, I've got some thoughts on a contemporary of Brecht's, another theater artist, whose approach to the theater may have represented an even more radical break with artistic convention and prevailing social norms. So check that out in a few weeks. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more epic, iconoclastic, and always quite useless adventures.